I am still traumatized by the internet discussion, is it cake? You would look at a leather shoe and think, that must be a leather shoe, why wouldn't it be? And then a knife ominously enters the frame, and it's actually a cake that looks and possibly tastes like a leather shoe. But that bad meme, which got turned into a game show, is a little too basic for us. I want something similar, but cake is usually delicious. What if instead we made something out of a cookie, but not a regular cookie, a very hard and dry cookie? And comparing regular household items is so measly. I want to compare the whole house. So welcome to my new game show, Is It a Gingerbread House? Okay, and now for our first contestant. Easy, that's a house. Okay, and that looks like a gingerbread house. And that's a gingerbread house, of course. Of course, it's looking quite house-like though. Ooh, and another, that's a house, I think. I would eat that, so I guess we'll say it's gingerbread. This game is harder than I could have imagined. The houses that look like they're made out of gingerbread are trying to look like real houses, and the real houses look like people put decorative frosting on the eaves. But I have insider knowledge. I have been inside one of these gingerbread houses. I got cursed by a witch and lived in a gingerbread house for most of 2012. That was a lie, but I did visit an old house on Staten Island where this woman once lived. It originally was a Dutch colonial farmhouse where rooms were added over time. Her grandfather had bought it in 1844, probably because this was the view. He spent 25 years remodeling it to this Carpenter Gothic style, which was very cool for rural homes at the time. But we are going to use this photo to better understand what makes this house feel gingerbready. There are the decorative verge boards that are allegedly made of wood, not royal icing. Decorative trim, which might be Necco wafers cut in half. The diamond-shaped casement windows, which could be made of a pretzel. Or the little cresting on the roof that feels like a decorative flare you might use to cover up some structural icing issues. And then for the sweetest thing I have ever seen on any house, edible or not, on each of the little finials on top of the gabled windows are little birdhouses. And I'm not the only one who said, damn, all that decoration makes it look like a gingerbread house. I mean, this guy wrote a whole book about Victorian architecture and called it The Gingerbread Age. But that title wasn't because these houses reminded people of a sweet treat. It was an insult. This writer, John Moss, was trying to take back a rude description. Because saying you're a gingerbread has been an insult for centuries. It could be the diss that helps you win Yo Mama 1605 edition. Thou liest, and thou wert a knight of gingerbread. You might say a knight was a gingerbread knight, meaning they were all for show and lacked real substance. That they're kind of a fake. Or a ship was covered in gingerbread work, decoration that was tasteless and gaudy. And when Moss was referring to gingerbread houses, he was referring to that. These houses that people thought were all for show, gaudy and tasteless. But there is a gingerbread house that is full of taste, an actual gingerbread house. What blew my mind while doing this research was gingerbread houses weren't really a popular thing until everyone read a horror story. I mean, a children's story. The story of a brother and sister abandoned by their parents in the woods because there isn't enough food. They find a house made of cakes and they start eating it. The old woman who owns the home invites them in for a meal. The old woman had only pretended to be kind. She was in reality a wicked witch who lay in wait for children and had only built the little house of bread in order to entice them there. When a child fell into her power, she killed it, cooked it, and ate it. And that was a feast day with her. And not to spoil the ending from the most famous German folktale from 200 years ago, but the little sister, Gretel, trips the witch into the oven and they don't get eaten. Now you hear a story like that and your takeaway might be, we got to make sure every child gets fed so kids aren't abandoned and exploited. But actually everyone's takeaway was, a house made out of cake sounds pretty cool. Now gingerbread had already existed long before 1812 when the brothers Grimm had published these folk tales. Across Europe, forms of honey cakes with ginger and without had been eaten since the 1200s. They were something you might get at a street fair with decorative gilding of potentially literal metal, or a rectangular version with nuts and dried fruit from Nuremberg. Or later, if you were an esteemed guest of Queen Elizabeth I, she might bake you and also roast you with a gingerbread caricature of her guests. Imagine how much icing you would need to make that neck piece. Would have been rough. This gingerbread popularity would have you thinking ginger was growing like crazy in Europe. But ginger is originally from China and likes warm, humid environments. Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic is where ginger was grown starting in the 1500s. It was at a much smaller volume than sugar, but was often grown in the same places on the same plantations with the same enslaved labor. With refined sugar and more spices, the recipes for gingerbread are changing at this time too. Recipes no longer call for honey, but instead sugar, ginger, and molasses. By the time you hit the mid-1800s, you're looking at recipes that feel pretty similar to what we have today. I may have flippantly compared gingerbread houses with gingerbread houses earlier. They really don't have that much in common. The edible gingerbread house was like the final boss of decorative cookies. You figured out how to make ornate little heart cookies and a gingerbread man with a personality. Well, now let's make it architectural and 3D, and instead of glue, you have to use eggs and sugar. Good luck. The actual houses that were rudely called gingerbread weren't trying to look like a cookie. The idea of the edible gingerbread house wasn't even that famous yet. They were just working with the latest materials and tools. Which brings me to the real-life version of the decorative piping bag, the scroll saw. Yeah, scroll saw, we're all so excited. Now we all kind of know what a saw is, the thing that murders people in the Saw movies. But did you know they were originally to cut wood? There are a million types of saws, and most of them are pretty straightforward. Like they literally have to go straight and forward or else they'll break. But there are exceptions and innovations in the saw game, and sometimes the best way to learn about it is to read a book for children on how to own and operate saws from 1912. This writer is a big fan of the scroll saw, and he is kindly going to explain it to us like we're 5th graders, because again, that is his target audience. A scroll saw is a very simple piece of apparatus, and it consists of a fine saw fixed in a frame, or otherwise supported, so that it can be moved up and down, and it is narrow enough to turn sharp curves. Now, scroll saws, as I shall call them, are of 3 kinds, and these are 1, those powered by hand, 2, those run by foot power, and 3, those operated by other kinds of power. He kindly shows us illustrations of how you use the hand scroll saw, and then gives recommendations on the best foot-powered scroll saws. The Lester scroll saw is $4.50, and he says it'll do the trick. But they do get fancier. His reason for recommending the scroll saw is simple, because it didn't take up that much room and taught an important skill. As you may have observed, it takes a pretty good-sized room for a shop and quite a lot of tools to do carpenter work and cabinet making. Now, if you find it hard to get these things, don't be discouraged because there are other kinds of woodwork that take neither a whole room nor a chest of tools. He didn't get too deep into the steam scroll saw because that seems less possible in a home setup. Although the scroll saw had existed for a long time, the steam power made it so much more efficient. It was no longer just for the rich. You could put fancy woodwork pretty much everywhere. And that's what people did. Your roofline is boring? Put up a decorative verge board. Your porch is boring? Put on decorative brackets and elaborate porch supports. There was another tool that the Handicraft for Boys recommended, which is a pedal-powered lathe. This would help create spindles, which you might find on railings. Once you can kind of identify how these pieces would be made, you start noticing them on all sorts of houses from the period. The icing-like details on Gothic revivals, the comedic amount of brackets on Italianates, again, the comedic amount of brackets on Second Empires. There is spindle work all over a lot of Queen Anne's and folk Victorians. But these styles weren't made by boys who read this book in 1918. These were created by local carpenters, builders, lumberyards in the 1840s and beyond. I talked about how gingerbread was originally a diss, and all those little details have been called gingerbread details. Now, John Moss, the writer of this book that I keep showing, he was very against this as an insult. He thought critics were placing European architecture on a pedestal while discounting the creation and creativity that was happening in the United States. Gingerbread has been most unfairly judged by dogmatic critics. The wooden fretwork of an Alpine farmhouse was whittled with a knife and they call it art. The wooden fretwork of an American farmhouse was cut out with a scroll saw, worked by a foot treadle, or driven by steam, and they label it degenerate. In truth, both are vigorous and pleasurable folk arts, 2 links in a worldwide chain of such crafts. The theory has been advanced that American gingerbread houses were copied from Swiss chalets. It is absurd. How many 19th century American carpenters took study trips to Switzerland? How many owned books about Swiss architecture? There are many thousands of gingerbread patterns. They vary from county to county, from town to town. Where did they come from? The architectural pattern books contained only a few drawings of brackets. Local carpenters and lumber mills worked out their own fanciful gingerbread designs. Now, he is very adamant that the details of these styles was coming from its own location, and that is very true throughout the 1800s. But now we're going to look at one of the very few exceptions that didn't even exist when he wrote this book. Welcome to Leavenworth, Washington. Somewhere along the timeline, it became a Bavarian village. The Great Northern train line would go through this area. People started mining gold and other metals there. But a lumber mill became the business of the town. The Leavenworth Echo published this article in 1904 on the opening of a brand new lumber mill with state-of-the-art machines. The article gets into every type of saw they used, but they didn't include a scroll saw, so we're moving on. It is estimated that the company will give employment to 200 to 300 hands in its various departments, including the logging camps in the mountains. The importance of this enterprise to this town cannot be too highly valued. It is only second to the Great Northern Railway. The company owns an extensive and valuable tract of timberland up about Lake Wenatchee, a large part of which is western pine, a valuable and useful wood for finishing. It has been estimated that there is enough timber to employ the mill for 20 to 30 years. So here was a sawmill directly on a train line that went from Seattle, Washington to St. Paul, Minnesota. And being on that line got this town access to a lot of infrastructure, like electricity and waterworks and a doctor. But let's enhance to the end of that paragraph. It has been estimated that there is enough timber to employ the mill from 20 to 30 years. Damn, I just learned about this mill and now it's ran out of wood? That article was written in 1904, and by the 1920s, the mill had closed down. The train line had rerouted the station to Wenatchee. It was a lot of losses for the town. And then there was the Depression. In the 1960s, the town was trying to figure out what was next. Around this time, two bachelor friends quit their jobs in Seattle and bought a cafe together. They added a motel and gave the whole place a theme. What a cool place. I sure wish you could just reach out and touch it. This is the squirrel tree. Bob and Ted had gone with a Bavarian theme because it was nestled in the mountains and reminded Bob of southern Germany where he'd been stationed after World War II. This is what it looked like when they owned it. The theme ended up stretching a lot further than just a cafe and a motel. The town of Leavenworth had been in discussions of what could help their economic depression. Project LIFE, standing for Leavenworth Improvement for Everyone, was looking for industries that the town could invest in. Bob and Ted thought tourism was the answer, and they offered up a theme that they had already tested, which is why you'll find a town that looks like this 5,000 miles away from its inspiration. And when you're in the actual town, I'm glad the teleporter comes with a scarf and a jacket. When you're in the actual town, you can see all the decorative verge boards, the brackets. It looks like a scroll saw went to work here. And there's other things that aren't that common in American gingerbread houses, which we'll go see now. Here it is. All that half timbering, all those murals, that's not what you would traditionally see in the American gingerbread house style. But the reason this town looks like this is because it's required to. If you want a storefront in this town, you have to adhere to these rules, which is how you end up with a ye old Subway or a Safeway to pick up your mead and mutton. It's funny to see chains change their personality to be able to be here, but it was local businesses that made that happen. This was the first building to be remodeled for this Bavarian town. There was no big financing from the state. Most of these private businesses just took out loans to do the remodels. Whew, it sure is getting cold. I wish there was a way I could go back home. Okay. Feels like that was a little clumsier on the drop off. What I kept noticing was it felt a lot more like a theme park. When it comes to the real gingerbread age, from the 1840s to the 1880s, it feels like the organic one-upmanship of embellishment. You start with inspiration from history and the technical capabilities, but then over time, as it gets more popular, more people's hands help it evolve. So when you look back, you notice this distinct style. John Moss was talking about that. Gingerbread is part of the universal design language of the 19th century. The very same scrolls and curlicues are found in Victorian ironwork, in the patterns for Victorian needlework and dressmaking, in the Victorian printer's fancy typography and ornament, in the Victorian Spencerian handwriting and flourishes. Houses aren't built in a vacuum. And Leavenworth might be an actual example of a place kind of built in a vacuum. On the bus into Leavenworth, not that I wasn't teleported, I was teleported. On the bus into Leavenworth, a girl talked about how she brought a friend from Germany, and her friend was like, "This is stupid, it's nothing like Germany." And of course it's not. This place is like a weird version of telephone, but it's relaying messages from The Sound of Music and your grandmother's 1,000-piece Thomas Kincaid puzzle. This is a town out of time. It has no historical context for being the way that it is. It's like this because it snows a lot here and is in the mountains, and reminded people of another place where it snows a lot and is in the mountains. But what does this do to the actual history of this place? This town and the surrounding area is where Icicle Creek and Wenatchee River meet. The Wenatchee people had their fishing rights at the Wenatchee fisheries taken away for decades and decades. Twice they signed treaties that would ensure their land and rights were protected. And twice those treaties were abandoned and ignored when it was no longer convenient. This allowed the train to map a route based on where the most resources were, and they could leave just as quickly when they found another place with better resources. When Bob and Ted were redoing the Squirrel Tree in the 60s, they also considered a Native American theme. Can only imagine that would have been pretty badly done and offensive. The town had also considered leaning more into a Western theme, or also the gay 90s, which meant the 1890s, and gay meant happy. Those themes might have shown more of the American gingerbread style that we've been talking about here. But it's pretty clear that the chosen theme has been a success, even if it's not connected to the town's actual history. And in that way, it might win being the most gingerbread, by that original definition of being showy but lacking substance. In this case, it's lacking that historical context that makes it make sense. But that doesn't mean it's not beautiful and charming and fun to experience. And you could say the same for an actual gingerbread house, like the edible kind. It looks delicious, but it's mostly for show, because if you tried to eat it after you displayed it for a few days, you would probably break a tooth. And as for the homes from the gingerbread age, those Victorian houses that were unfairly labeled gingerbread, they are showy and ornate, but they are also an accurate depiction of the style and the priorities at the time. People wanted elaborate details, and they got them. And today we still get to see the ones that are left, and enjoy that someone made some nice verge boards with some icing and a piping bag. I mean, some wood and a scroll saw. Thank you all for watching this video. This month on my Patreon, around the 15th, I will be making a gingerbread house cookie. My plan is to avoid making something 3D and just do like a nice house facade. I also have very little experience with piping bags. This is the one other time I tried making anything, so this will be kind of a comedy piece. If you want to learn more about the Alice Austen house, which I mentioned at the beginning, I did a whole episode on her life and her house on my podcast, Someone Lived Here, which has been uploaded here on YouTube with photos. And also it's on any of your favorite podcast apps. I appreciate you all being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.